Boston wind cut through the glass towers that morning, sharp enough to make the windows hum. I stood in the executive conference room on the 42nd floor of Zenith Systems, watching the city stretch out below me like a circuit board of ambition and steel. The harbor reflected a pale November sky, and somewhere in the distance, a ferry moved slowly through water the color of brushed aluminum. Everything felt orderly, predictable, the kind of morning where billion-dollar decisions get rubber-stamped over lukewarm coffee and PowerPoint slides no one really reads. I had no idea that within 7 minutes, my entire career would detonate. And within 2 hours, a $6.3 billion merger would collapse so completely that financial analysts would still be dissecting it 6 months later. My name is Maya Keller. I'm 43 years old and I've spent the last 18 years working in telecommunications infrastructure compliance. That's the kind of job title that makes people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties, but it's the backbone of every major telecom deal in North America. I'm the person who reads the contracts no one else wants to touch, the technical annexes buried 300 pages deep, the legacy agreements signed before half the executives in the building were even hired. I know which clauses matter and which ones are decorative. I know where the pressure points are. And I know exactly how much weight a single sentence can carry when billions of dollars are shifting hands. Zenith Systems had been my professional home for nearly 2 decades. I started as a junior analyst fresh out of MIT, reviewing spectrum licensing agreements in a windowless office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Over the years, I worked my way up through layers of bureaucracy, technical audits, and late-night emergency calls when deals threatened to implode. I became the person leadership quietly relied on when things got complicated. Not the person they celebrated in company newsletters or invited to executive retreats, but the person they called at 11 at night when a regulatory filing was due at dawn and no one else understood the requirements. I live alone in a brownstone apartment in Back Bay, 3 blocks from the public garden. My husband passed away 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. He was a high school history teacher, the kind of man who could make the Continental Congress sound like a thriller. We never had children. After he died, I threw myself into work because silence at home became unbearable. The apartment still carries traces of him. His favorite mug in the kitchen cabinet, a stack of books on the Civil War he never finished, a wool coat hanging in the closet that I can't bring myself to donate. Work became the place where I could control outcomes, where effort translated directly into results, where I didn't have to think about the empty chair across from me at dinner. That morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The merger with Atrium Communications had been in motion for 11 months, and we were 48 hours from the final signing. Atrium was a mid-sized fiber optics company with a strong presence in the Midwest, and Zenith wanted their infrastructure to expand into markets we'd been locked out of for years. The deal was structured, vetted, and blessed by every department from finance to legal to regulatory affairs. Or so everyone believed. I had been reviewing the compliance documentation for weeks, cross-referencing licensing agreements, frequency allocations, and interconnection protocols. It was tedious work, the kind that required reading the same paragraph 5 times to catch a single inconsistent date. But that's what I did. That's what I was good at. And 3 days earlier I'd found something that made my stomach drop. Buried in Appendix 19C of the original Zenith operating charter, a document drafted in 1997 when the company was still a regional player, was a clause that had been dormant for so long that most people had forgotten it existed. Clause 47D stipulated that any acquisition involving spectrum reallocation across state lines required the explicit written approval of the Director of Infrastructure Compliance, with a minimum tenure of 15 consecutive years at the company. The clause couldn't be waived, amended, or bypassed without triggering a mandatory regulatory review that could delay the merger by 18 months or kill it outright. I was the only person at Zenith who met that requirement. The only one. When I first discovered it, I thought it might be a drafting error, some archaic language that had been superseded by newer agreements. I spent 2 entire nights going through every amendment, every board resolution, every legal opinion filed in the decades since. The clause was still active, fully enforceable, and absolutely critical to the Atrium deal. I drafted a memo and sent it to the executive leadership team, flagging the issue and recommending we address it before the final signing. I explained the clause, outlined the compliance path, and offered to coordinate with legal to ensure everything was handled correctly. It was straightforward, professional, the kind of thing I'd done dozens of times before. I never received a response. Not from the chief operating officer. Not from the general counsel. Not even from my direct supervisor, who usually replied to my emails within an hour. Silence. Complete and total silence. First, I assumed they were busy. The merger was consuming everyone's bandwidth, and my memo was probably sitting in an inbox somewhere, waiting for someone to have 5 minutes to read it. But as the days passed and the signing date approached, the silence started to feel deliberate. That morning, as I stood in the conference room waiting for the final pre-signing meeting to begin, I realized something had shifted. The energy in the building felt wrong. People avoided eye contact in the hallways. Conversations stopped when I walked past. My access badge, which normally opened every door in the compliance wing, had been quietly downgraded overnight. I couldn't get into the executive archives anymore. I couldn't pull up the merger documentation on the internal server. Someone had locked me out, and they'd done it quietly enough that I almost didn't notice. The conference room door opened and Jacob Turner walked in. Jacob was Zenith's new chief strategy officer, a role he'd been promoted to 6 months earlier after a high-profile stint at a private equity firm in New York. He was 47, tall, expensively dressed, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly wrong about anything important. He had an MBA from Wharton and a habit of speaking in half-finished sentences, as if everyone around him should be smart enough to fill in the gaps. People either loved him or hated him. There was no middle ground. I'd interacted with Jacob a handful of times since he joined the company, mostly in large meetings where I presented compliance updates and he nodded without really listening. He wasn't someone who valued the work I did. To him, compliance was a checkbox, a bureaucratic formality that existed to slow down the real business of making deals. He once told a room full of executives that regulatory people think in straight lines, but the market rewards curves. Everyone laughed. I didn't. Jacob set his phone on the table and looked directly at me. His expression was flat, clinical, the way someone might look at a malfunctioning piece of equipment they were about to replace. Maya, he said, we need to talk about your memo. I straightened slightly, relieved that someone had finally acknowledged it. Good. I was starting to think it got lost. We need to address Clause 47D before. There's nothing to address, Jacob interrupted. His tone was sharp, dismissive. The clause is outdated. Legal reviewed it and determined it's not applicable to this transaction. I frowned. That's not correct. I've reviewed every amendment to the operating charter, and the clause is still active. It specifically requires. Legal made the determination, Jacob repeated louder this time. Your job is compliance oversight, not legal interpretation. You flagged it. They reviewed it. It's handled. Something cold settled in my chest. Jacob, I don't think you understand. This isn't a judgment call. The clause is unambiguous. If we proceed without the required approval, Atrium can void the merger, and we'll be facing a regulatory investigation that could. I understand perfectly, Jacob said, and his voice dropped into a register that made everyone in the room go still. What you don't understand is that this deal closes in 2 days. We've spent 11 months on this. We have board approval, shareholder approval, and regulatory clearance from the FCC. We are not derailing a $6.3 billion transaction because of a clause written during the Clinton administration. I held his gaze. Then you need to get my written approval. That's what the clause requires. Jacob's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. Your approval isn't required. Legal has already determined that the provision is superseded by more recent governance structures. You're being obstructive, and frankly, it's starting to look like you're trying to insert yourself into a process you don't control. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. I felt my pulse accelerate, but I kept my voice steady. I'm doing my job. The clause exists to protect the company from exactly this kind of risk. If you ignore it and the deal collapses, Zenith will be liable for breach of fiduciary duty. You'll be personally exposed, and so will everyone else who signed off on this. For a moment, Jacob didn't respond. He just stared at me, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He wasn't angry. He was deciding. Effective immediately, Jacob said, you're suspended pending an internal review of your conduct. You'll surrender your access credentials, leave the building, and await further instructions from HR. The room went silent. I heard someone's pen drop. A young analyst near the back of the room inhaled sharply and didn't exhale. I stood slowly, my hands steady, my voice calm. You're suspending me for doing my job correctly? I'm suspending you for insubordination and for disrupting a critical business process, Jacob said. Security will escort you out. 2 security officers appeared in the doorway as if they'd been waiting just outside. They didn't look happy. One of them, a man named Colin who I'd known for years, wouldn't meet my eyes. I gathered my tablet, my coat, and my bag. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't give Jacob the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. I walked out of that conference room with my head up, my spine straight, and my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. As I stepped into the hallway, I glanced back once. Jacob was already on his phone, pacing near the window, talking fast. The other executives sat frozen, staring at the table as if the wood grain held answers. I walked through the lobby, past the reception desk, past the glass-walled break room where colleagues I'd worked with for years suddenly found their coffee extremely interesting. The revolving door spat me out onto the street, and the November wind hit me like a slap. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, watching people stream past on their way to work, oblivious to the fact that somewhere 42 floors above them, a man had just made the worst decision of his professional life. I pulled out my phone, opened my personal files, and looked at the scanned copy of Clause 47D that I'd saved 3 days earlier. Then I looked at the calendar. The merger was scheduled to close in exactly 47 hours. Jacob Turner thought he'd removed an obstacle. What he'd actually done was activate a countdown he didn't know existed. And the clock was already ticking. If you're still with me, let me know where you're watching from. I'm curious how far a story like this travels. I didn't go home right away. I couldn't. The idea of sitting alone in my apartment, staring at the walls while my career disintegrated, felt unbearable. Said I walked. Boston in November is cold enough to keep your thoughts sharp, and I needed clarity more than comfort. I ended up at a small cafe near Copley Square, the kind of place that smells like espresso and old books, where freelancers camp out with laptops and nobody bothers you if you sit for hours. I ordered a black coffee, found a corner table, and pulled out my tablet. For the first time in 18 years, I wasn't working on Zenith's problems. I was working on my own. I opened the file containing Clause 47D and read it again slowly, the way I'd read it a dozen times before. The language was dense, legalistic, but the core requirement was crystal clear. Any acquisition involving cross-state spectrum reallocation required written approval from the Director of Infrastructure Compliance with at least 15 years of consecutive tenure. No substitutions. No exceptions. No workarounds. I scrolled through my employment records. I'd been at Zenith for 18 years and 4 months. I'd held the title of Director of Infrastructure Compliance for 16 years. I was the only person in the company who met the criteria. The previous director had retired in 2007, and his replacement, me, had been in the role ever since. Jacob Turner had been at Zenith for 6 months. The general counsel had been there for 3 years. None of them had the institutional memory to know that Clause 47D existed, let alone that it was still enforceable. They'd relied on legal summaries, executive briefings, and truncated due diligence reports. They'd assumed that because the clause was old, it was irrelevant. They were wrong. I pulled up the merger agreement and skimmed through the sections dealing with regulatory compliance and spectrum transfer. Atrium Communications held licenses in 7 states, and the deal involved consolidating those licenses under Zenith's federal operating umbrella. It was exactly the kind of transaction Clause 47D was designed to govern. Without my signature, the deal wasn't just incomplete. It was void. I sat back in my chair and stared out the window. People hurried past, bundled in coats, faces bent against the wind. Across the street, a construction crew worked on scaffolding, their voices muffled by distance and glass. The world kept turning, indifferent to the small catastrophe unfolding inside Zenith's executive suite. My phone buzzed. A text from Elena, one of the senior analysts in my department. Maya, what happened? Jacob sent an email saying you're on administrative leave. People are freaking out. I hesitated, then typed back. Long story. I'll explain later. How's the team holding up? Her response came fast. Confused. The Atrium deal is supposed to close Friday, and nobody knows who's signing off on the compliance docs now. I stared at the message. Nobody knows who's signing off. Because there was nobody. Jacob had removed the only person who could authorize the transaction, and he'd done it so impulsively that he hadn't bothered to check whether I was replaceable. Another text arrived, this time from Alan, the Deputy General Counsel. Asterisk. Maya, I need to talk to you. Privately. Can we meet? Sis. Alan was one of the few people in leadership I genuinely respected. He was methodical, careful, the kind of lawyer who read footnotes and checked citations. If anyone at Zenith understood the gravity of what Jacob had just done, it was Alan. I texted back. Asterisk Thinking Grounds Cafe, Copley Square. I'll be here for a while. Sis. 20 minutes later, Alan walked in. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his usually immaculate suit jacket wrinkled. He spotted me in the corner, ordered a coffee at the counter, and slid into the chair across from me. This is a disaster, he said quietly. I know. Alan rubbed his face. I didn't see your memo until this morning. It went to the executive distribution list, but somehow it never made it to legal. I think Jacob intercepted it. I raised an eyebrow. He buried it? Deliberately, I think. He didn't want anyone second-guessing the timeline. Alan pulled a folder from his bag and set it on the table. I went back through the operating charter this morning after I heard you were suspended. Clause 47D is active. Fully enforceable. And you're the only person who can sign off on the Atrium transfer. I know, I said again. Alan leaned forward, his voice low. Maya, if this deal closes without your approval, Atrium can void the entire transaction and sue us for breach. We're talking hundreds of millions in penalties, maybe more. And the FCC will open an investigation into our compliance practices. This could destroy the company. I met his gaze. Then why did Jacob fire me? Because he's an idiot, Alan said bluntly. He saw your memo as a threat to his authority. He thought you were trying to derail his deal, so he removed you before you could cause problems. He didn't understand that you are the deal. Without you, there's no legal pathway to closing. I sipped my coffee, letting the bitter heat settle in my chest. So what happens now? Alan exhaled slowly. I'm going to brief the board this afternoon. They need to know the situation. But Maya, you have to understand, Jacob has a lot of support among the executive team. They see him as the future of this company. If I go to the board and tell them he just killed a $6.3 billion deal because he didn't read the fine print, there's going to be a bloodbath. Good, I said. Alan blinked. Good. He suspended me in front of my team for doing my job correctly, I said, my voice steady but cold. He humiliated me, questioned my integrity, and threw me out of the building like I was some kind of saboteur. So yes, Alan. If there's a bloodbath, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. Alan stared at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I can't say I blame you. He stood, leaving his coffee mostly untouched. I'll keep you updated. But Maya, if the board asks you to come back and sign off on this deal, what are you going to say? I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the people passing by, at the construction crew still hammering away, at the gray November sky pressing down on the city. I'll think about it, I said finally. Alan nodded and walked out. I sat there for another hour, watching the light shift across the table, thinking about Jacob Turner's face when he told me I was suspended. Thinking about the way he dismissed my concerns as if they were background noise. Thinking about the fact that in less than 2 days he was going to realize exactly what he'd done. And I was going to be nowhere near that building when it happened. By late afternoon the news had spread. Not publicly, Zenith was too good at managing optics for that, but internally the rumor mill was churning at full speed. My phone buzzed every few minutes with messages from colleagues, some sympathetic, some confused, a few cautiously asking what really happened. I ignored most of them, but one message caught my attention. It was from Irving Caldwell, the CFO. Irving had been at Zenith for nearly 2 decades, longer than almost anyone in the C-suite. He was old school, meticulous, and notoriously difficult to rattle. If Irving was reaching out, something significant had shifted. Asterisk. Maya, I need to speak with you as soon as possible. This is urgent. Please call me. Sis. I stared at the message for a moment, then dialed his number. He picked up on the first ring. Maya. Thank God. Where are you? Copley Square. Why? Stay there. I'm coming to you. He hung up before I could respond. 15 minutes later, Irving walked into the cafe. He looked worse than Alan had, pale, visibly shaken, moving with the unsteady gait of someone who'd just received very bad news. He sat down heavily across from me and didn't bother with pleasantries. "Did you know?" he asked. "Know what?" "About the clause 47D. Did you know it would kill the deal?" "Yes," I said. "That's why I sent the memo." Irving closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath. "Jacob told us it was handled. He said legal had cleared it. He said you were being obstructive and trying to slow the process down for personal reasons. And you believed him?" Irving opened his eyes, and for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen in him before. Genuine regret. I didn't question it. I should have. But Jacob has been pushing this deal for months, and we were so close to the finish line. I assumed he knew what he was doing. He didn't. "No," Irving said quietly. "He didn't." He pulled a tablet from his briefcase and turned it toward me. On the screen was an email chain, time-stamped from earlier that morning. The subject line read, *urgent. Compliance issue, Atrium merger. I scanned the messages. Alan had sent a detailed memo to the board, outlining Clause 47D, explaining its legal implications, and noting that my suspension had created a critical gap in the approval process. The replies came fast and furious. Confusion. Panic. Demands for clarification. And then, buried near the bottom, a message from Jacob. This is a manufactured crisis. Clause 47D is a procedural formality that can be addressed post-closing. Legal has confirmed we have multiple pathways to compliance. Maya Keller is using this as leverage because she's upset about being held accountable for her behavior. I looked up at Irving. That's a lie. There are no other pathways. The clause is explicit. I know, Irving said. Alan made that very clear. But Jacob is insisting he's right, and half the board doesn't know who to believe. They're holding an emergency session in 2 hours to figure out what to do. I leaned back in my chair. And what do you think they should do? Irving met my gaze. I think they should reinstate you immediately, apologize for Jacob's behavior, and beg you to sign off on the deal before Atrium walks away. And if I say no? Irving's expression hardened. Then Zenith loses $6.3 billion, our stock crashes, and we spend the next 5 years trying to rebuild our reputation. But Maya, I need to know, if we reinstate you, will you sign? I didn't answer right away. I thought about the memo I'd sent, the one that was ignored. I thought about the way Jacob had looked at me like I was a problem to be eliminated. I thought about 18 years of work, of late nights and early mornings, of holding the company together through regulatory nightmares and technical crises, all while being treated like a necessary inconvenience. I don't know, I said honestly. Irving nodded slowly. Fair enough. But Maya, whatever you decide, you need to understand something. This company doesn't work without people like you. People who care about getting it right, not just getting it done. Jacob doesn't see that. A lot of the executive team doesn't see that. But I do. And I'm sorry it took this disaster to make me say it out loud. He stood, buttoned his coat, and paused at the door. The board meets at 6. If you change your mind, call me. Then he was gone. I sat alone in the cafe, watching the daylight fade into early dusk. The construction crew across the street had packed up and left. The coffee shop was emptying out, replaced by the evening crowd looking for wine and small plates. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Bloomberg had picked up the story. Zenith Systems merger talks with Atrium Communications reportedly stalled. Sources cite internal compliance dispute. Stock down 8% in after-hours trading. I read the headline twice, then set the phone down. The clock was ticking. And somewhere in a conference room 42 floors above the city, Jacob Turner was realizing that the obstacle he'd removed was the only thing holding his deal together. The board meeting started at 6. I wasn't there, but I didn't need to be. By 7:30 my phone was ringing non-stop. Messages flooded in from executives, board members, even a few analysts I'd worked with years ago. Everyone wanted the same thing, for me to come back and fix the mess Jacob had created. I ignored them all. Instead, I sat in my apartment, a glass of wine in hand, watching the city lights flicker through the window. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Ms. Keller. The voice was unfamiliar, professional, carefully neutral. My name is Justin Wade. I'm the CEO of Atrium Communications. I sat up straighter. Mr. Strauss. What can I do for you? I understand there's been a complication with the merger. That's one way to put it. I've been briefed on Clause 47D, Justin continued. And I've been told you're the only person at Zenith who can authorize the spectrum transfer. Is that accurate? It is. There was a pause. Ms. Keller, I'm going to be very direct with you. Atrium has spent 11 months negotiating this deal. We've restructured our entire operations plan around the assumption that this merger would close. If it falls apart now, it's going to hurt us badly. But I want you to know something. I'm not calling to pressure you. I'm calling because I need to understand what happened. I took a breath. Jacob Turner suspended me this morning for raising concerns about the clause. He dismissed it as outdated and accused me of being obstructive. Then he removed me from the building. Justin was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. He fired you for doing your job? Yes. And Zenith's board is only now realizing the deal can't close without you? Apparently. Another pause. Ms. Keller, let me ask you something. If you were in my position, would you trust Zenith to follow through on this merger? I didn't hesitate. No. I wouldn't. Justin exhaled slowly. Neither would I. I'm pulling Atrium out of the deal. Effective immediately. My breath caught. Mr. Strauss. This isn't about you, Justin said. You did everything right. But a company that fires its compliance director 48 hours before a major closing because she flagged a legal issue? That's not a company I want to do business with. I'm terminating the agreement tonight. Have you told Zenith? I'm calling them next. But I wanted you to know first. You tried to protect both companies and they punished you for it. That's not something I take lightly. He hung up. I sat in the silence of my apartment, staring at the phone in my hand. The deal was dead. Not because of Clause 47D. Not because of me. But because Jacob Turner had been so determined to assert his authority that he'd destroyed the one thing he was trying to protect. My phone rang again. This time it was Irving. Maya. His voice was hoarse, strained. Atrium just pulled out. Justin Wade called the board directly and terminated the agreement. He cited fundamental concerns about Zenith's internal governance and compliance culture. I know, I said. He called me first. Irving let out a bitter laugh. Of course he did. Maya, the board is in chaos. Jacob is trying to salvage this, but it's over. The stock is going to crater when the market opens tomorrow. We're looking at shareholder lawsuits and SEC investigation, the whole nightmare. What about Jacob? He's done. The board voted to suspend him pending a full investigation. They're talking about terminating him for cause. I should have felt something, vindication, satisfaction, maybe even pity. But all I felt was tired. Irving, I said quietly, I sent that memo 3 days ago. If anyone had listened, none of this would have happened. I know, Irving said. And I'm sorry. For what it's worth, the board wants to reinstate you immediately. Full back pay, public apology, whatever you need. I'll think about it. Maya. I said I'll think about it, Irving. Give me 24 hours. I hung up before he could respond. The next morning, Zenith stock opened down 23%. By noon, it had dropped another 11%. Financial news outlets were dissecting the story in real time, calling it one of the most spectacular corporate failures of the year. Analysts questioned how a company could come within hours of closing a $6.3 billion deal only to have it collapse over a single personnel decision. I watched the coverage from my apartment, sipping coffee, feeling strangely detached from the chaos. My phone had stopped ringing by mid-morning. Either people had given up or they'd been told to leave me alone. Around 2 in the afternoon, I received an email from the board's chairman, William Harding. It was formal, contrite, and carefully worded by lawyers. Asterisk, Dear Ms. Keller, on behalf of the Zenith Systems Board of Directors, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the events of the past 48 hours. Your suspension was unjust, unwarranted, and reflected a failure of leadership at the highest levels of this organization. We would like to offer you immediate reinstatement, full back pay, and a formal public acknowledgement of your professionalism and integrity. Additionally, we would welcome the opportunity to discuss your future role at Zenith, including potential promotion to Senior Vice President of Compliance and Risk Management. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. Sis. I read it twice, then deleted it. An hour later my phone rang. It was Justin Wade again. Ms. Keller, I hope I'm not overstepping, but I wanted to follow up with you. I'm listening. Atrium is moving forward with our expansion plans, just not with Zenith. We're exploring other partnerships and we're looking for someone to lead our compliance and regulatory strategy. Someone who understands the complexities of spectrum allocation and isn't afraid to speak up when something's wrong. I felt a small smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Are you offering me a job, Mr. Strauss? I'm offering you a conversation. If you're interested. I looked around my apartment, at the empty chair, the old books, the quiet that had once felt suffocating but now felt almost peaceful. I'm interested, I said. Good. I'll have my assistant reach out to schedule a meeting. And Ms. Keller? Thank you for having the integrity to do the right thing even when it cost you. You're welcome. We hung up. I stood, walked to the window and looked out over the city. Somewhere across town, Jacob Turner was probably sitting in a conference room, trying to explain to a team of lawyers how he'd managed to destroy a $6.3 billion deal in under 2 hours. Somewhere else, the Zenith board was scrambling to contain the fallout, drafting statements, calling shareholders, trying to salvage what was left of the company's reputation. And I was standing in my apartment holding a phone with a job offer from the company Jacob had tried to acquire. I thought about my husband, about the way he used to say that integrity wasn't about being rewarded, it was about being able to look at yourself in the mirror. I thought about the memo I'd sent, the one that had been ignored, the one that could have saved everyone if anyone had bothered to read it. And I realized that I didn't need Zenith to reinstate me. I didn't need their apology or their promotion or their acknowledgement. I just needed to know that when it mattered most, I'd done the right thing. The rest would take care of itself. If you've stayed with me this long, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most weight. And sometimes, the people who get fired are the ones who are holding everything together. 3 weeks later, I accepted Justin Strauss's offer and joined Atrium Communications as their Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Compliance Strategy. The role came with a significant raise, a seat at the executive table, and something I hadn't experienced in years: respect. Atrium's offices were in Chicago, which meant leaving Boston behind. I packed up my apartment, donated most of my husband's belongings, and kept only the things that mattered. The books, the photos, the wool coat that still smelled faintly of him. It was time to move forward. Zenith, meanwhile, entered a spiral it never fully recovered from. Jacob Turner was terminated for cause 2 weeks after the merger collapsed. The board released a tersely worded statement about failures in executive judgment and due diligence. But the damage was done. Shareholder lawsuits piled up. The SEC opened an investigation into the company's compliance practices. And within 6 months, Zenith was acquired by a larger competitor at a fraction of its former value. Irving Caldwell called me once after I'd started at Atrium. He sounded older, worn down by the endless crisis management. Maya, he said, I just wanted you to know, we should have listened to you. All of us. Not just Jacob. We all failed. I know, I said gently. But thank you for saying it. For what it's worth, the company's different now. Smaller. Quieter. A lot of the old guard is gone. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Irving was quiet for a moment. Maybe not. Take care of yourself, Maya. You too, Irving. At Atrium, I rebuilt the compliance framework from the ground up. Justin gave me the resources and the authority to do it right. No shortcuts, no compromises, no executives overruling technical decisions because they were inconvenient. Within a year, Atrium had become the industry standard for regulatory excellence, and other companies started reaching out to learn how we did it. I was sitting in my new office one afternoon, reviewing a licensing proposal when my assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Keller? There's someone here to see you. She says it's personal. I looked up, curious.